Mesdames et messieurs, on espère que le déjeuner s'est bien passé.
Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed your lunch. This session of our forum is going to be devoted to management and digital society. First of all, a conference entitled Social Media Industrial Dialogue, a new equation for the future. I'd like to welcome on stage Christophe AGUITON, sociologist, Orange Labs, co-founder, ATTAC, and Pascale Porteres, Vice-Chairwoman of the BPI Group. Come and join me, please. So, looking at the intrusion of social networks within companies, we know that it all raises quite a few issues, but let's recap on what is happening here and there.
Messages échangés chaque jour, un moyen de communication inédit dans l'histoire de l'humanité, décentralisé, au coût dérisoire et très viral. L'information n'a jamais été aussi instantanée et les idées circulent vite, très vite. Certaines explosent même en révolution. Tunisie, Égypte, Libye, on parle de la révolution Facebook. La jeunesse se mobilise à travers un média difficilement contrôlé par les autorités. La peur disparaît, les dictateurs aussi. Mais les internautes n'ont pas attendu Facebook ou Twitter pour exprimer leurs revendications à travers le réseau. Septembre 2007, des employés italiens d'IBM lancent une protestation globale sur Second Life. Plus de 1800 avatars seront comptés dans cette toute première cyber-manifestation, moyen alors unique pour regrouper en un même endroit des centaines d'employés dispersés de par le monde. L'initiative intrigue et interpelle nombre de grands médias. Les syndicats le savent très bien, c'est cette médiatisation classique et mainstream qui a eu les effets escomptés. Les revendications salariales sont acceptées, car s'ils sont un formidable moyen de regrouper des gens et des idées éparpillées sur la planète, les réseaux sociaux n'ont jamais eu autant de force que quand ils sont repris par les grands médias nationaux.
En quelques heures, la mésaventure d'Anne-Marie Costa a enflammé le web. Cette caissière d'hypermarché a failli être licenciée pour avoir récupéré un ticket de caisse abandonné contenant une offre commerciale. La réaction de sa direction, qui a porté plainte pour vol, a scandalisé des dizaines de milliers d'internautes. Un tollé qui a fait reculer l'enseigne.
Mobilisation en France contre le licenciement d'une caissière. L'image du supermarché souffrira au-delà du mauvais buzz, car là aussi, ce qui fait l'événement sur les réseaux sociaux est repris à la télévision. Dernière initiative en date l'hiver dernier aux États-Unis, jusqu'alors plus ou moins laissés à l'écart lors des négociations salariales. Les 42 000 employés de Ford syndiqués chez United Auto Workers ont quasiment suivi heure par heure l'avancée des négociations à travers Facebook et Twitter, à tel point que le syndicat a été dépassé par sa base, puisqu'une majorité a refusé net la proposition d'accord de principe. Entreprises, syndicats, partis politiques, les réseaux sociaux interpellent toutes les organisations. Une nouvelle donne 2.0 que les dirigeants vont devoir appréhender.
Pascale Porter, Christophe AGUITON.
Pascale Porter and Christophe AGUITON. Do you think it's fair to compare that with the Arab Revolution spring? Yes, absolutely. Models here in France or in similar countries of democratic societies are not the same. Here what we have are reticular networks. Individuals are involved in that, and we have massive people involving themselves. Now, in the eve of the presidential election here in France, if we only were to bet on social networks, we would be completely off the mark, because people love live meetings and attend them massively. The fact that there are so many people going to those political meetings or watching that on their TV sets shows that the middle link is being weakened. People want to have a way of expressing themselves directly, either through the social networks, or when they have to make a choice and choose and elect their president, they want to see it for themselves directly, so to speak. People want to have a direct connection with the person they might elect, the candidate they might elect. In social conflicts or movements, it's quite different. Second Life is not the real life. What we see is that through tweets and Facebook, the basic employee is having a say now, and something was initially launched by the trade unions, but then to go on strike. But then it was decided not to do it because of people speaking on Facebook, etc. So what I'm saying is that it cannot replace these conflicts. Christophe AGUITON, the internet is buzzing with everything, but it's not what is going to replace the vote or the election. Absolutely not. Yes, I agree with you. You still need staff representatives and trade unionists with whom you can have an agreement or not. Spontaneous expression matters, is important, but when it comes to solving problems or conflicts, it's still traditional structures that work. And what about you, Christophe? Why would you say that this is so popular? Is it the echo chamber of people's opinions? Well, the internet is a media, but it's going to be all the more so important as the traditional media don't work very well. We've seen it with the Arab Spring, and basically the social network is the only way of expressing yourself. In France, when you have a political offer which is very well distributed with a very wide spectrum of candidates from the extreme left to the extreme right, social networks don't change much about the opinion that, in fine, the French people will have about their candidates. But remember the campaign for the referendum on the referendum 2005. It was on the net, only on the net, that people were against it. And when the internet started out in '95 in France, when offers started being sold, it was basically the unemployed and people with no idea who started using it. So things were quite different then. But now a second idea is something we should reflect upon, is where does the internet come from? It is the product of American counterculture. People always think about Ministry of Defense, but it's not just that. It's more to it than that. Yesterday, David Crocker, one of the founders of the internet in the 70s, came to a meeting last year, and he wanted us to look at the images of Woodstock, and it was late, people were tired, but he insisted on that because it was his culture. David Clark, who says also, we do not believe nor in kings nor in presidents or in the voting principle. What we believe in, what we want, is consensus and a code that works. This is exactly what young or less young activists in movements such as Occupy or the Indignados do. They are saying they want real democracy, which is based on consensus, a bit like the internet. Let me comment on this concept of the consensus. If we say that social networks and Twitter most particularly, but Facebook also, are instruments, they are consensus instruments. Either you like or you don't like, but there is not much of a middle way. When you are dealing with real life issues in conflicts or collective bargaining within companies, a compromise must be struck between the interests of all the parties concerned. So by essence, it's difficult to imagine that social networks could work on a compromise at the same time. You'll never achieve a consensus. So there's a bit of a divide there that you should keep in mind when people say, oh, well, you can use social networks to solve all problems. This is not true. Internet is a media of the individual, which can go against the word of a trade union, which is a collective voice. Yes, the internet was built for the individual in the 70s, an individual who's ready to extend solidarity and to collaborate, to work with the others. Web 2 is both an entrepreneurial and a social movement. But for trade unions, it's difficult to integrate that culture, because what matters for trade unions is the collective structure, it's the collective opinion, for, against, an agreement. Going through the individual is not part of the traditional modus operandi of trade unions. Yes, I'd like to take that up and say that there is a notion of the individual, but also of individuals together, which is not quite the same thing as individuals within a collective structure. This is what you find in by job or work categories, and this is works the best within companies. You can federate people around an issue that brings them together because they feel concerned individually. And within social networks, what are these communities? It's just saying words, expressing opinions and sharing them, but that's all. These actions on the internet are reminiscent of what we had in the 80s. Yes, I was saying that the internet is particularly important when traditional media do not really represent the public opinion. When trade unions do their job, well, they are recognized, such as what we had in France with the pension movement. They were joined by employees, by retirees, etc. But if you go back about 20 years and you remember movements such as that of the nurses in France, unions were not ready to support them for many different reasons, and they organized themselves in what we called coordinations, and they tried to organize themselves differently, not through trade unions, sometimes even against trade unions, and in so doing forced trade unionists to react, because up until the 70s, the trade union would decide whether employees would go on strike or not. Now it's different, and trade unions have learned to promote the direct expression of employees, otherwise it's doomed to failure. So trade unionists have been pushed, they had to change, and they will have to change again to achieve what we have now on the internet. Along different line of thought, we also have claims which are more connected to working conditions, for instance, and are not at all carried forward by trade unions, but by individuals who are faced with that on a daily basis. I remember that example of a retailer, stores, medium-sized stores or retailers, but covering the whole of France. And one day they were faced with the issue, may seem quite simple, of safety shoes for cashiers, and they started saying on the network, we're fed up with wearing those shoes. We don't need them, which is not entirely true, because they need them when they go into the warehouses. And it almost turned into a real claim, protest from trade unions to improve the image of these cashiers. And then finally one said that in a catalogue of professional shoes, she had found some shoes that looked much nicer, and perhaps this model could be suggested and to replace the old one. So the idea of better working conditions was killed, so to speak, by the proposal on the network of a cashier who solved the problem by suggesting a nicer pair of shoes. Maybe it was suggested to her by some shoe manufacturers. Well, who knows? But how can a company react to what we've seen earlier about these claims and demands coming from different people now? First of all, there should be a corporate a social network trying to look at problems, trying to come up with solutions. And the second, way about it within companies would still be to go through middle management and supervisors, who are the natural relays of complaints at the employee level. On social networks, you don't have any middle management anymore. You just have employees expressing themselves. And what I'm saying is that if you don't take care of those who are supposed to be the voice of the employees, you will be faced with a lot of difficulties, in my opinion. A lot of companies, however, say that they are present on social networks, and trade unions as well. What does it mean to be present or to have a presence on social networks? What does it mean? About trade unions, I think Christophe could answer that better than I could. But it's true that trade unions take a lot of initiatives to be present, to talk about issues. There's an association that was set up working with human resources management, working on social networks in the steel industry. Also, I have an example whereby there is they have put on their network a serious game, mocking a recruitment session, etc. So, trade unions are, and it's quite normal, getting into that game as well, and they are pushed to do this by the younger generation, which is quite normal. Now about companies. Companies are all starting to have their own social network, but who's heading the social network? Who's moderating? Is it free? Can you say anything? Is it organized or not? The very fact of having social networks is in a company is a good thing, and I think everybody agrees to that principle. Could be a dedicated social network, it doesn't have to be Facebook. And then the answers provided will be based on specific cultures, etc. Acceptance from top management of all that. So the answers will vary, of course. What we are seeing, which seems to be the most effective, are what we call trades communities. Bring together people who are quite separate geographically speaking, far apart. And here we see that people want to come together because they do the same thing. They have the same job or a similar job. Bringing together within the same community on a social network people who do the same job, who can exchange tips, ideas, and focus on real issues is something new. It didn't exist before, and it's now feasible through social networks. Just want to add something about trade unions. In the 90s, as I said, people who didn't have ID papers, ID means, and the unemployed were present on the internet. Now we have the dissident movement, so with the Indignados, with the Occupy in Madrid, London, New York, inspired by the Arab Spring. But basically, the idea is to give a mode of expression to individuals. And there, internet is the #1 mode of mobilization. What about good practices, good examples of social networks that are well conceived, well designed, and that do work? It's like saying, you know, I have my blog and you haven't published anything. It's not because you have a tool that people will come. The conditions for a real online dialogue must exist. Well, the #1 question is, why do we do it? What's the purpose? Is it to give a mode of expression to people who can't usually say anything? It is to shorten distances, geographical distances between people. I think one thing we're sure of is that social networks that work well are the ones that appear to be obvious based on similar jobs, community of jobs, or functions such as human resources networks. Be a sad thing if a social network dedicated to human resources didn't work. Yes, well, the way in which the network is led and regulated is also very important. Doesn't mean that you're going to ban anything or that you're going to enforce rules that go against the freedom of expression. No. Now, there are abuses, cases of abuses. They exist everywhere. But the community seems to self-regulate expression, individual expression, quite well. It's true that with the internet, people think that they speak, but in fact, they don't speak. They write. And words, once they're written, do remain. And then another issue, who goes on the social network? How long is it going to last? Is it something that will be long-lasting or short-lived? There are measuring indicators. You have to make the network sustainable and can only be sustained when there are groups that really got committed in it because they want to share something that they have in common. You mentioned this a while ago. Is it a problem for middle management, people that were in between basic employees and top management? And the same question applies to trade unions. Because social networks tend to level off everything by providing direct access and by squeezing everything between the top and the bottom. There's a real contradiction here. There's a social desire to have a more direct form of control on what we do, educational aspects, or people not wanting to have churches or political parties telling them what to do. But on the other hand, in the political sphere, in the social sphere, the number of meetings, the places are going to increase, for instance, and this takes a lot of time because you have to attend all these meetings, internal negotiation within businesses, with works councils, etc., etc. All this does create a sort of middle structure which is useful, but not necessarily in keeping with employees' desires. And it's a source of tension. I'm not saying that it's not useful and that we should get rid of these places, meetings, etc., but perhaps we should think about doing it in a different way. So also a question of time and constraints. Whether you're talking about middle management or trade unions, if you think about the time consumed in attending all these meetings, etc., it's endless. Therefore, you have less and less time to spend with your employees. And, of course, everybody's saying these days that manager who's not close enough with his own employees is a manager who is missing out on something in mobilizing and encouraging his employees. All this takes time. It has to be recognized, and it's not necessarily a priority at the moment. Finally, if there's a dialogue directly one-to-one between the employees, we saw that with the trade union negotiating an agreement with Ford employees, and at the same time, members of the trade union, UEW, were saying on the internet, we don't agree. Well, it's a more direct form of democracy, promoting participation, and the idea is that we want to be really involved, committed, and involved in the decisions that matter for us. And I think it's a positive trend ultimately. What is more difficult is what Pascale was referring to just a while ago, the difference between the written word and the spoken word. These things are now, once I said, are cast in stone. For instance, we see it in the presidential campaign here. Candidates must be able to manage microphones, cameras, etc., following them everywhere. But when you attend a meeting in a small room somewhere in a small town, it's different because everything's being recorded, everything's being filmed. In olden times, you could apologize. It's not really what I wanted to say, and I didn't really say it. Perhaps they did, but you could always pretend and say, well, no, I didn't say it, etc. And ultimately, everybody would say, well, fine. But now it's put down in writing and it's cast in stone. And that's going to create problems. We are no longer in the scenario of an employee with his employer having a face-to-face discussion. Now it's quite different. People are on Facebook. They are talking about their company on Facebook, and then someone turns them in and they go to court and they are fired, etc. Was it fair to fire them? Case law is not clear on that, but something fundamental remains. There's this gray area which has to be protected. A manager should not be open to look at emails without formal acceptance from his employee. And however, on social networks, it's not clear. So it's a real issue for the corporate world, and case law will have to make decisions on that, or new regulations will have to be adopted and enforced. If we look at examples you were mentioning just now, well, when nothing happens, when everything goes well, it's quite comfortable, in fact, to be able to have a direct sort of face-to-face dialogue between the employee and the employer, squeezing middle management. And it's much more comfortable, in fact, for everybody. But when a crisis erupts and when you have employees who are opinion leaders, not necessarily trade unionists, but they are recognized as opinion leaders on social networks, blogs, etc., they have no clout, they have no leeway. And then middle management is out. You can't rely on them because you didn't rely on them before. It's a bit late now to mobilize them, and they have no credibility nor any legitimacy with the employees. And when opinion leaders have no real legitimacy, it's going to be very difficult. And in times of crisis, we're going to be faced with this scenario and these situations, and we'll have to come up with solutions to solve all that. Examples of social networks that do work. I will not ask Christophe AGUITON the fatal question about Plaza. You didn't say the question, you don't need to answer it. But question, what about gamification within the corporate world? Yes, well, it's all about serious games. It's all about education, and education is something you can do or provide within companies as well. Culture of secrecy within human resources departments. And what about social networks? Well, they don't always have a culture of secrecy. Some human resources still play a transparent game. Wanting to be transparent is not necessarily a corporate culture, but there are sectors where people try to infuse more transparency, particularly when it comes to communication, social communication, and the balance between representatives of staff and top management, something which should lead to more transparency, albeit sometimes you feel that the real decision is being made elsewhere, and then you're faced with a decision, that's it. But Facebook, for instance, promotes more transparency, it's true. What about the problem? What about the French situation where you have very few trade unions? Well, this I don't think that's really relevant. In France, being in a trade union is really being an activist, whereas in other countries, Germany, US, etc., it's different. In Belgium, for instance, the unemployment benefit is something which is managed by trade unions. So that's why Belgians are members of trade unions. In France, the criterion is the electoral participation. I'm talking about professional elections, of course, to elect works council members, etc. I just like to insist on one thing, which is the balance of power. These new practices, of course, upsetting the traditional balance. If we don't find a new balance, as is there are more crises looming ahead, well, then we'll have to find new places where we can negotiate and where we can actually achieve results and find solutions, new solutions, providing for a true compromise, a good compromise. If we don't find that balance, we'll be faced with tremendous difficulties, in my opinion. What about these communities based on common practices? Is it possible to do that through social networks only and no physical encounter? Well, this form of community, when it can meet from time to time, I mean physically in the flesh, is better. But there are some communities out there where members are all over the planet and where it's very difficult to bring people together, and yet they share, they have that in common, and they manage to build something together. Jobs, for instance, you were talking about Plaza. Computer experts, they're used to exchanging, sharing, so of course they quite naturally go on social networks. What about moderating social networks? Is something to be done before or after, so to speak? Well, it has to be done by members themselves. There was a survey on LinkedIn saying that things said by their members are not that off the track, really. So the best form of moderation is that, through the members, from the members. In a business, it's different because there's a strong temptation to say, well, I only want to keep what is in my favor and reject the rest. But on social networks, of course, it's a completely different game. Yes, you should, of course, make a clear distinction between what's on social networks and comments you can read in newspapers such as the Figaro or the Monde here in France. On social networks, you only talk to the one you're in contact with or your friends. So your audience is limited de facto. And again, in times of a crisis, that's where we are faced with difficulties because there's less control, less regulation, less self-moderation. Sometimes we are led to say things we didn't think, and if you were in a General Assembly, it was only orally would have been different. But once it's written, it's quite a different ball game. Thank you. Well, we have to clear the stage now, so to speak. So thank you very much. And we're going to continue.